I will move on to the question of the Supreme Court. So, two questions I want to ask about the Supreme Court. This is the first one. This is the case that changed the abortion landscape in this country. Abortion was illegal in most of the United States. There were some, I think, a couple of states that had legalised it under some conditions, and the Supreme Court changed all that in Roe versus Wade. It's no longer the most current decision on it, but it's still the basic one. It was being tweaked a little bit in the Casey decision and some others, but it's still a guiding decision. And here's a couple of quotes. So the first striking thing is that the court acknowledges that the Constitution does not explicitly mention any right to privacy. Well, that's obvious. They have to acknowledge it. It's just not there. There's no such right. Then there's been a lot of discussion as to whether you can somehow get a right to privacy out of the Constitution. And as they say, there's different ways in which you can do this up here through the 14th Amendment or the 9th Amendment or whatever. So there's different ways in which you might be able to get to a right to privacy. But we think you can, and we think it's broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. So the important point here is that it's clearly an interpretation of the Constitution, even to say that there is a right to privacy. It's not explicitly stated there. Secondly, there's a claim that this right to privacy is broad enough to incorporate a woman's right to terminate her pregnancy. So there's a lot going on that obviously, if you're an originalist in the interpretation of the Constitution, as Scalia, for example, is, you would not be, you would have grounds for thinking that this is an interpretation that had nothing to do with what the authors of the document really had in mind, and that raises one question about it. But then let's look more specifically at some of the argument. The state may properly assert important interests in protecting potential life. So there's a recognition there, and there's also this interesting phrase, potential life. And they then go on to say, at some point in the pregnancy, this interest in protecting potential life becomes strong enough to regulate the factors governing abortion. And that was the basis for rejecting the idea that a woman has a right to abortion at any stage of pregnancy. That would have seemed to be the implication of the first slide I gave you, the privacy right. But here that's said to be not the case. Now, the phrase potential life is interesting because given what we've been talking about earlier, there clearly is a human organism that is alive during pregnancy, after conception. I mean, I think the view that says life begins at conception has to be accepted as correct if you're talking about the life of the human organism. Or if not quite at conception, because there's some debate about at conception you have a collection of cells and you could have one organism or two organisms. You can't tell whether you're going to get identical twins at conception. Only about 14 days after conception is that clear. But let's say then we say, just not at conception, but certainly by that time you have an individual living human organism. And it's a bit of a stretch to call it potential life. You could, of course, call it a potential person. There's no doubt that it's not a person because it's not conscious. And if consciousness is essential for personhood, at least up to about the first 20 weeks of gestation, there's no person there. And arguably, I'd say there's no person quite a lot later. But if you're talking about the life of a human organism, I think it's strange to say that you're protecting potential life. You're protecting the actual life of a human organism, which has typically been what the law has protected. So that reasoning looks a little bit suspicious here. And there's also a bit of lack of explanation as to why this becomes more compelling. If you're talking about potential life only, why it becomes more compelling as you get closer to birth. Because there's not much change in the likelihood that it will become a person. There's certainly early miscarriage. But once you get beyond the first few weeks of pregnancy, there isn't a lot of change in the potential of the being. Let me give you one more slide about this. And this is why the Roe versus Wade decision is like the women's rights argument, in that it tries to avoid taking a view about the moral status of the fetus. We need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins, they say. And then they say, well, philosophers, theologians, doctors or whatever can't arrive at any consensus. We don't know, but we don't agree that by adopting one theory of life, Texas, because this was a case about the state of Texas, may override the rights of the pregnant woman that are at stake. Well, I think that's pretty hard to say, because if the fetus has a life, and if that life is to be protected by law in the same way as the life of other human beings, like all of us in this room, it seems that states are justified in overriding privacy rights to protect those lives. So it's really, I mean, you need to think about this a bit more. Can the court really strike down a statute that is prohibiting abortion without deciding that the fetus does not have the same claim to live as other people do? I think it has to be making that decision in some way or other. And the final thing that I want to say about Roe versus Wade, I'm sorry this has all been quite quick, is the sort of underlying philosophical question of whether we really want courts to make these decisions. Obviously, courts will need to make some decisions about whether the Constitution is being followed or not. For example, if Congress tried to say there will be no elections for the next 10 years, you need a court to say that's contrary to the Constitution. But within the framework of a functioning democratic process in the state of Texas and in other states, should the court be striking down the decisions of democratically elected state congresses, state legislatures, on the basis of something that it acknowledges is not explicitly in the Constitution? Don't we really think that a democratic process is the proper way of deciding controversial questions like this? Perhaps because I grew up in a different kind of constitutional tradition, the parliamentary tradition in Australia, I have to say I find it strange that we should have unelected courts making this kind of decision.